This is Jed Distler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. You can subscribe to this podcast through my Substack page by clicking on the link in the episode description. Paid subscribers will get bonuses, such as Piano Maven Zoom meetings, where we will share listening experiences, and sometimes we'll have special guests. So please consider subscribing to help us reach out further into the piano community and to keep this podcast in production. We come to the end of our exploration of all 32 Beethoven piano sonatas in this mini-series where I have been recommending 2 different recordings for each sonata. One recording is historic in nature, meaning from 78 RPM discs, or a mono LP release, or an archival recording that's been commercially issued or else readily available online. And the second recording that I recommend is a modern recording, meaning from the stereo or digital eras, and is a commercial release. The object has been not to repeat any pianist throughout this survey, so that means we will have talked about 2 pianists for each sonata, totaling 64 pianists and 32 sonatas, or 32 sonatas with 64 pianists. I've decided to cover Beethoven's last 3 sonatas in this one episode, mainly because these works often are linked together and many pianists perform the last 3 Beethoven sonatas in concert. I've seen several pianists do so, like Maurizio Pollini, Alfred Brendel. Myra Hess did this also. I never saw her, of course, I was too young, but she made a big thing about playing the last 3 Beethoven sonatas in concert. Rudolf Serkin did also, and I'm sure there are so many others. Oh yeah, Igor Levit recently did that, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't see him in concert, but I know that he has programmed the last 3. The Sonata number 30, Opus 109 in E major, is a sonata in 3 movements. The first movement is almost an improvisation, and it leads directly into a tumultuous prestissimo movement. And then you have the wonderful theme and variations finale, which is the 3rd movement. And this movement probably is famous for the long chains of trills. And long trills kind of became a signature of Beethoven in his last works. Among the historic recordings that I would love to recommend, I cannot recommend Arthur Schnabel's 1932 recording for the simple reason that I already spoke about Arthur Schnabel in this mini-series, and in fact, I recommended him for the very first sonata, Opus 2, number 1. However, I do have a good historic recommendation. This is a recording from the early 1950s, and it features the Danish pianist Victor Schroeder, who was a pupil of Schnabel, and this is an absolutely terrific performance. It's very much in the Schnabel mode, but there's a little more sense of repose, perhaps, in the first 2 movements. This is poetic and aristocratic pianism that's impeccably controlled, yet totally heartfelt. Now, my modern recording recommendation is in many ways a historic recommendation because it's an interpretation that involves an instrument that not only Beethoven knew, but it was an instrument that was made by the Broadwood Company for Beethoven that was outfitted with a device that would enable the composer to hear himself play as much as he was able to hear himself. We haven't spoken at all in this podcast about Beethoven's growing deafness and the impact of his affliction on his composing. There have been so many studies about this, and that's outside the parameter of this podcast. But I want to talk about a release on the Evil Penguin label. Yeah, that's the name of the label. And this release is titled Inside the Hearing Machine, Beethoven on his Broadwood. And on this release, the forte pianist Tom Began performs Beethoven's last three sonatas on a reconstructed Broadwood that also reconstructs the devices that they provided that helped Beethoven hear the instrument to the best of his capability. And there's a real clarity to the instrument that comes across, and also the resonant overtones are very palpable. But the main reason I'm picking this recording for a modern recommendation is because, in addition to the uniqueness of this instrument, Tom Begin's interpretation is really unlike any that I've heard before. He plays the opening movement with tremendous force and freedom and wide contrasts and dynamics within the dynamic limitations of his instrument. There's a lot of variety in the timbres and also a lot of variety in Tom Begin's articulations and agogic phrasings, and he really does make this music sound like an improvisation. He does not tear into the prestissimo so much as he teases it. There's a tiny hesitancy in the opening phrases, but the inflections of rhythm keep listeners on their toes, and it's an interpretation that brings out more of the music's exploratory side than its surface determination. And I find that very convincing and quite absorbing to hear. Now, the way that Tom Begin handles the third movement variations may give conservative-minded listeners some pause. He adapts a kind of walking tempo for the theme, and he also embellishes a lot on the repeats, and he does this on all of the repeats throughout the movement. And you get the feeling that the theme is less a meditation than one usually hears, but his performance actually conveys the sense, I think, of an invitation or a suggestion to embark on the upcoming journey of variations. So, consequently, the first variation very naturally progresses out of the theme. I know that the embellishments are going to catch you off guard if you are familiar with this sonata and its many recordings, but I think perhaps Beethoven would have been intrigued by it all. I'm not going to go into detail about what Tom Begin does with each and every variation, but suffice it to say that his creativity and his imagination and his brilliant sense of timing and ability to convey character all impart a fresh spin and a kind of structural revelation to this music. The rubatos and the various modifications of tempo and inflections of phrase seem to have an organic and deeply internalized feeling about them. And I've always felt this way about Tom Begin's playing. For instance, his cycle of Haydn's complete sonatas on the Naxos label is a really, really interesting and compelling cycle. Also, his earlier Beethoven releases, I think, are cases that make my point. And this release with the last three Beethoven sonatas I highly recommend, and I've chosen his recording of Opus 109 for the modern recommendation here. And again, Victor Schürler is my historic recommendation. Now we get to Beethoven's Sonata number 31 in A-flat, Opus 110. It begins with a gracious and lyrical movement that evokes a saraband. While the scherzo is jocular and it's full of those off-kilter rhythmic displacements that typify the Hammerklavier Sonata scherzo. Actually, even the Eroica Symphony scherzo has that kind of offbeat accentuation that keeps you guessing. But the last movement of Opus 110, actually, some people say movements 3 and 4, but they are kind of welded together because it begins with a recitative that's a lamenting song, and then it leads into a fugue. And the fugue isn't really a fourth movement because after the fugue, the lamenting song returns in a more brooding and intensified form. And then the fugue emerges out of that again. But now the fugue starts building with an ecstatic kind of cumulative momentum. This is such a beautiful piece, and it's really very fulfilling and gratifying to listen to it as well as to play it. For my historic recording recommendation, I've always liked that graciously turned out 1953 recording by Myra Hess. Now, maybe it's not as special as her Opus 109 from the same sessions, but I think it's very beautiful and poised, and I really wanted to have Myra Hess in this mini-series. So I think her Opus 110 is really quite beautiful, and I want to talk about a pianist from my modern recommendation who I thought was very special, and she died way too young of breast cancer in 2019. I think she was only 46, if I'm not mistaken. And her name is Dina Ugorskaya. She was the daughter of the pianist Anatol Ugorsky, who recently passed away. Now, some listeners may feel that Dina Ugorskaya's rhetorical phrasing and expressive gestures might be a little bit mannered or self-aware, but I get the sense that she has, like Tom Began with Opus 109, that she has internalized the music to a really profound degree, and I think she's more probing than affettuoso. Yeah, I guess there's a degree of what I would call musical method acting, but I do hear real sincerity and a feeling of putting the music ahead of the personality. But this is an impression that I think you really have to listen to the recording to get. Don't just take my word for it. I think listen, and maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you won't agree with me, but that's okay too. So now we come to Opus 111. When pianists say, oh, I'm playing 111 or I'm playing Opus 111, you don't have to ask questions. You don't have to say, oh, what Opus 111, Brahms or Fauré or Saint-Saëns or... No, when you say 111, everybody knows immediately that you're talking about Beethoven because it's a very iconic sonata. I mean, the last Beethoven sonata. And it has a dark first movement introduction that might be described as a bleaker and more desolate manifestation of the Pathétique sonata's first movement introduction. And this leads into a faster section that's marked by relentless counterpoint and jagged accents with very little respite. The second movement, Arietta, is a theme in variations, where the stark and sublime theme is first subjected to variations where the note values become quicker and quicker, and then the music returns to the theme in an altered form, and the piano writing floats up into the highest register, and we get these long, ethereal chains of trills where it seems like heaven is gently opening up. I mean, that's kind of a cliched analogy, but I don't know. That always comes to my mind when I'm encountering this music. My historic performance choice is one that is cathartic, expansive, volatile, reposeful, and at all times emotionally generous. And I think it's a performance that does bypass the piano en route to the music. The pianist is Howard Karp, who lived from 1929 until 2014. He taught for many years at the University of Wisconsin, and he used his position there to really create community with music making. I think he was one of the best examples of being a huge fish in a modest-sized pond. But there's nothing modest-sized about his pianism. He's a world-class artist and a fantastic interpreter. And you can hear that in a 6-disc set of live performances that came out on the Albany label as a tribute to Howard Karp. And this is a really fabulous Opus 111. Howard Karp is the pianist. Definitely check it out. Now, for my modern recommendation, I could not choose Maurizio Pollini in this case, even though he is the big paradigm in this sonata. I couldn't choose Pollini for the simple reason that I used Pollini to talk about Opus 22 several episodes back. However, there is a wonderful studio recording with Annie Fisher that's on the EMI label. Her Hungariton remake is also wonderful, but I think the EMI recording from the early 1960s really captures her in her absolute unambiguous prime. And if you listen to her first movement introduction, there's much more harmonic tension than usual in those descending sequences. And there's more of a conversational battle between the hands when the allegro section kicks in. And her selfless concentration throughout the arietta, it's like the music is speaking for itself. This is just wonderful, unself-regarding music making, and I highly recommend this recording. So there we have it. We have discussed all 32 Beethoven sonatas, recommending 2 recordings for each sonata, 1 historic recording and 1 modern version. And we did not repeat a pianist, did we? That means we have 32 sonatas and 64 pianists. I'm going to post the complete list of recommendations on my Piano Maven Substack page so you can access it. Needless to say, this mini-series has been a kind of journey, and I hope that these podcast discussions have led you to some special listening discoveries yourself, and I hope you'll continue to explore these pianists in their respective Beethoven recordings. I know I will keep continuing to do so. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. We're going to go back on our regular 2 episodes per week schedule, although I may get inspired and add an extra episode every now and then, or we may do another crazy mini-series like this. I have a lot of cool things in store for you. So thank you so much, and please consider subscribing. I look forward to being with you next time.